Hello, I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and welcome to our session today on 21st century elections, AI, misinformation, and disinformation. Certainly a timely topic. It's part of our ongoing series, the Denver Democracy Series, that leads up to our fourth Denver Democracy Summit that will be happening in January. So we're delighted that you're all with us today for this very timely session. First, let me thank our sponsors, our partners and supporters. You see them here on the screen. Let me highlight some of them who are participating today: the Atlantic Council, Freedom House, and International IDEA. So thank you very much to our partners and supporters. Let me say a few words about the history of the Denver Democracy Summit. We had the idea before January 6th of 2021. Already it was clear that U.S. democracy and indeed democracy around the world was in trouble. And so we had the idea of convening some of the world's experts on the state of democracy here in Denver. Little did we know that January 6th would happen, and so it turned out to be incredibly timely. And since then, we've been doing annual summits, assessing the state of democracy around the world, and thinking of ways that we can support and reinforce democratic governance here in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world. So this is the current season of this leading up to, as I said, in January. Today's program is part of a series. Some of you may have joined us for our first session in September, where we did a survey of the world. This year, 2024, is really a year of global elections. More than half the planet is taking part in elections this year. We had a fabulous discussion of the state of democracy around the world. Today's session I'll say more about, but we're really honing in on one very important aspect of elections today, that is the role of information, disinformation, misinformation, and of course the very hot topic of AI and how that might be playing into it. We'll have another session shortly after the U.S. election, debriefing the election, likely to be, well, very interesting. We certainly are staring at an incredibly close election, and there's every reason to think that it might still be contested at that point. So that will be very timely. And as I've mentioned already, we're leading up to our summit, January 23rd and 24th. That's of course, the week of the inauguration. So we'll be in one of two worlds, presumably, at that point here in the United States. So with that, focus on today, on 21st century elections. And it's the role of information, misinformation, disinformation. It's not really a new thing. I mean, there's a long history of false misinformation and intentionally false disinformation in American politics and indeed in politics everywhere. More than a century ago, Mark Twain said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. The various other forms of that statement. So it's not necessarily new, but it does seem, certainly here in the United States, that maybe it's getting worse. Even recently, we have lies about Katrina and Milton and misinformation, disinformation that spread about them, or about Haitians in Ohio, or about the 2020 elections. So it does seem perhaps like it's getting worse. Today we have just a fabulous panel to discuss that. Our first session that I'll moderate this morning, and then a second session after a break where we'll show some great videos. And let me introduce very briefly the panelists here. So in order that they appear on your screen, Graham Brookie, who's vice president at the Atlantic Council, where he leads the Digital Forensic Research Lab, which I'll ask him what that is, and their technology programs at Atlantic Council. Alberto Fernandez Gibaja, who heads the digitalization and democracy team at International IDEA, based in Stockholm, Sweden, and Ali Funk, who is the lead of the Technology and Democracy program at Freedom House. So just delighted that the three of you could join us this morning. I can't think of a better panel, really, to talk about these issues. So let me just start with, let me just ask each of you to say just a brief word about what it is you do at your organization. What's your focus? What are the things that you're really looking at? And maybe start with you, Ali. What is it you're doing at Freedom House on technology and democracy?
Well, first, thank you all for joining us. What a fun and also spooky topic for a Friday in October. Really great to be here. So my name is Ali Funk. I oversee our Technology and Democracy Initiative at Freedom House. For folks who don't know us, Freedom House is an independent organization. We were founded back in 1941, the oldest U.S. organization working on democracy and freedom around the world. And we use a unique combination of research, advocacy, and direct support to human rights defenders. So I oversee the research side of the house, no pun intended, on all things tech, democracy, and human rights, particularly our Freedom on the Net report. For folks who don't know it, it's a global study of the state of human rights online. We're actually launching the next edition next Wednesday on some of the trends we'll talk about today. So I will not break our embargo, but if you'd like to join us next week, please go over to our website and you can RSVP for that event. So in addition to doing our research on different tech trends, also working closely with democracies to make sure that they're living up to their own values at home and in their foreign policy. So working with the Freedom Online Coalition, for instance, and then working really closely to try to get tech companies to better their own policies and practices so they advance human rights online.
Terrific. Well, thank you for that. Graham, what is the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and what are you doing at Atlantic Council?
Yeah, so the Atlantic Council is a foreign policy think tank that is headquartered in Washington, D.C. And it was started after World War II. It's 70 years old, and its charter is the Atlantic Charter, which is one of the founding documents that led to the founding documents of the United Nations, and is focused on working with allies and partners to shape a global future towards democracy. And side note, I'm a Colorado native, and so I'm extraordinarily jealous that I'm not actually in Colorado today. In DC, it's a little colder, but ironically. But the Digital Forensic Research Lab within the Atlantic Council is a team that looks at online harms. We got started about 7 years ago. Prior to that, I worked at the White House National Security Council for 4 years. And we had this challenge where online information environments were impacting everything from elections to safety and conflict zones, responses to natural disasters, which is deeply relevant today in the United States. And so this research team is looking at online information environments using open sources, meaning sources that you have access to as a general user, as a general public. And the approach is to look at how those information environments are impacting democratic institutions or democratic processes. And so building a lot of standards for more open source research so that we have better fidelity on how those things are impacting democracy. And that team today is spread out across 17 different countries. We work really closely with organizations like Freedom House. I'm really excited about the latest iteration of Valley's report that's coming out next week. And the whole point is to have folks, experts, subject matter experts, in communities where we're actually engaged in the information environment.
That's terrific. Thank you for that. And Graham, what is happening at the international level? Well, you're all looking internationally to some extent, but at the international IDEA.
Hi,
Alberto,
thank you.
Sorry, it's Alberto. Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
My apologies. Alberto.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be in here. It is a pleasure. So for those of you who don't know International IDEA, International IDEA stands for the Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We are an intergovernmental organization made up by 35 member states that span the whole globe. So countries like Canada, like Sweden, where we are based, Chile, South Africa, India, Mongolia, Indonesia, Germany. Yeah, we have a pretty diverse membership. And International IDEA has just one mandate, which is supporting democracy worldwide. We are headquartered in Stockholm with offices all over the world and regional offices covering basically the whole world. International IDEA and the digitalization program that I have the pleasure of leading focus on four specific things. We produce knowledge. If you work for an electoral management body or a counter-violent institution, very likely you have used one of our manuals or policy recommendations. We provide technical assistance. We are asked by authorities or by civil society to provide technical assistance that can range from sitting down with the pen and help write a constitution in a Pacific island to review policies or facilitate dialogue. We convey dialogues in general with our member states, with civil society, between governments and civil society on all topics, democracy. And then we do advocacy. We do advocacy as an intergovernmental organization with member states at international and multilateral organizations and at multi-stakeholder spaces. Obviously, working on defending democracy and supporting democracy worldwide, we can't ignore the fact that the intersection of technology and democracy is having a tremendous impact on the global state of our democracies, and hence that's why we're here.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, as our audience can see, we have a lot of firepower here, so very excited to have a chance to talk with you about. So just coming back to the sort of broad framing I gave it at the beginning, what are we seeing this election year? Is this getting worse? What are the issues that you really are seeing in the work that you're doing around misinformation, disinformation? And let me just start. We can start anywhere, but I'll start with you, Graham, and then come to Ali, and then Alberto.
So this year has been particularly interesting for us. If you have a team of 30 people and 4 billion people voting in elections in some shape or form, it's a hard research task to set yourself up for, which I know Alberto and Ali could probably commiserate with. And so at the very beginning of the year, how do you, with a team that is all around the world, how do you confront or figure out how to cover and identify trends with online harms that impact elections? And some of our hypotheses at the very beginning of the year were that AI is something that we're going to have to better understand, although we don't have a huge amount of case studies to really, really know how generative artificial intelligence in particular impacts election cycles. Now we do have some good findings there. Number two, we're in an era of increasing geopolitical competition. And so state actor, and to be clear, the information environment itself is both hyperlocal and global. And so how that global competition for information impacts specific information environments around national elections is very, very high impact, something that we were going to focus on quite a bit. And to the extent that we see disinformation in particular, which is the intentional spread of false information as opposed to the more kind of pervasive, permissive, unintentional spread of false information, misinformation, how disinformation is a market. And how, especially in places like the United States, we unfortunately have an enormous amount of market demand for false information that reconfirms pre-existing beliefs or doubles down on our own individual biases. And so how do you address that in the context of a massive, if we're talking to our international research team, we're talking about a World Cup year of elections. If we're talking here in the United States, we'll say Super Bowl, because the colloquials make better sense. But those are the three things that we were looking at the very beginning of the year. And with the artificial intelligence side, we probably all saw headlines at the very beginning of the year and throughout the year that said AI is going to supercharge election disinformation, which the main finding, which I hope we can get into, is that we're seeing a lot of generative artificial intelligence content creation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's having much of an impact. We would say it's pervasive, but not necessarily persuasive. And then on the geopolitical competition side, yeah, we're seeing a lot of adversarial actors, state actors in particular, continue a trend that we have seen in past election cycles, which is attempts to influence or in some cases interfere in elections. And so that is a trend line that is increasing that we can get into. And on that disinformation demand side, unfortunately, what we're seeing, at least here in the United States, even in the last 48 hours or 1 week, is that we have a lot of demand, and that information environment is getting more diffuse in many ways, more structurally diffuse, more fractured in many ways, which creates an easier landscape for disinformation to take root, or for false information or detachment from fact to take root, which are 3 really scary trends for, less so the first trend, but those second 2 trends are 2 really scary trends for the shared set of facts that democracy depends on.
Thank you. I mean, you put your finger on a lot of the drivers that seem to be accelerating this phenomenon. Certainly market demand, geopolitical actors, state actors, and the like. Ali, are you seeing similar things? Are you also seeing these kinds of drivers accelerating, particularly disinformation, I suppose?
Absolutely. I mean, first I'll just taking a step back. I think it's important to acknowledge in any discussion around what do we see around the information environment, just how hard it is to study the information environment and to get sound evidence-backed research on what's going on. And we can hopefully have some time to unpack why that is. But from our own work, we've looked at sort of the evolution of content manipulation campaigns, disinfo campaigns, around 3 sort of categories. 1 is the actors behind them. 2 are the platforms that they're doing this work on. And then 3 is the technology that they're using to create or distribute false misleading information. So first on the actors, there is obviously both foreign and domestic actors that are creating and spreading false and misleading information in elections around the world. Our research has focused a lot on trying to track those domestic actors. So last year's Freedom on the Net report, which again, you'll get new data next week, looked at, of the 70 countries we covered, 47, we found evidence of pro-government commentators that manipulated information. And who are those people? It can be sometimes government actors themselves. Ministries have full teams that do this. What a job to just create and spread this stuff. But increasingly, we're seeing the outsourcing, which I think is what Graham was getting at about the growing market for disinformation. So increased demand driving more supply. So, really influencers are a huge challenge in this problem. Influencers can really exploit the loyalty and the trust that they've built with their audiences to launder false misinformation. And particularly what would seem as non-political influencers. So people that are focused on, fitness or fashion. You saw some of that in Taiwan's election. And also, these shady public relation firms where they're just selling these services. And what that allows, the outsourcing of the creation and spread of this content, it allows political actors to reach more niche audiences that maybe they couldn't before. And it also allows them to draw on innovation and expertise from a private sector that they might not have internally. The second, around platforms, you're seeing a proliferation of platforms. This is not unique to this year. This has been around, a trend for the past few years of companies with different moderation approaches. Telegram being the sort of big example of this. It's just a breeding ground for influence operations because of the company's explicitly hands-off approach, where these campaigns can just go wild. You've seen the impact of X's rollback, formerly Twitter's rollback of content moderation policies, raising a concern here. And I think the sort of proliferation and number of platforms that this stuff spreads across means that any one intervention from one company might have less of an effect. So it really speaks to a need for cross-company and industry engagement around this issue. And then lastly, on tech, I know we're going to get into this. Much of the work, it's still done by people, but AI has played an increasing role. So I'll stop there, but looking forward to dive in on how
we'll
that is.
definitely dive in a bit on AI, because it was such a, leading into the season was certainly on all the headlines. Alberto, again, sort of a similar question, I suppose, what you're seeing, and perhaps at a global perspective, I'm curious in particular, the extent to which these kinds of things, the dynamics that Graham and Ali are talking about, are happening, everywhere, or is the United States, if not unique, at least ahead of the game in this space?
Thank you. Contrary to common belief and common practice, the United States is not an outlier here. The things that have been presented by Graham and Ali are, two of them were actually in my notes, which are influencers and platforms. So very happy that we're thinking in the same line. What we have been seeing this year is to a certain extent, is nothing new. We knew that the problem is never the organization of an election. We have had billions of people voting, and most elections have been run quite smoothly. There's minor problems, which is normal when you get a lot of people voting, but elections are being run pretty smoothly. What hasn't been that smooth is the information environment around elections. We had a great opportunity this year, which is to have scientifically empiric evidence in many different countries, so we don't have to rely on the countries that have much more information, which tend to be the big Western economies. So we saw, for instance, how this issue with influencers was, for instance, fundamental in Indonesia, in the Indonesian elections, in the Indian elections as well, which they already gathered like almost half of the voters of this year. There is an industry of influencers that are, as Ali presented, they are influencers or disinformers for hire, and they will spread any message that is given to them or that resonates with their communities. But there is also a very perverse effect of influencer jumping into politics because that attracts revenue. And hope we get time later to speak about the big elephant in the room, which is the nature of how social media work and ranking algorithms. But there is a lot of influencer market that is just jumping into politics because that's what driving revenues, driving traffic to their channels, and elections are a perfect opportunity to increase their presence. And we don't know because it is impossible to know, although the Atlantic Council does amazing work on this. We don't know their connections with potential foreign actors or domestic forces, but obviously there is a connection there. Platforms are also change. We're seeing how we have to be agnostic about platforms in our policies. We can't design policies for a particular platform. That's never going to work. We need to do as we did with the Geneva Convention. We need to ignore the technology that goes behind a platform because that's going to change, and then look into the substance of it. But if there is one thing that I can highlight that we are increasingly seeing this year around the information environment is that it's becoming more and more clear that it's all about building communities and reinforcing people ideas, people often grown ideas or detached from reality ideas. It's about keeping people on your side. And this might be also an effect of concatenation of different crises that have created certain pockets of population that have become radicalized and quite detached from society. And the size of those pockets of population change country by country. But we might be observing something that is that the information environment is becoming the transmission belt between people and power. This is how people is aggregating interest. they just join communities online, and those communities are easily manipulable. So what used to be the role of political parties, aggregating interest and putting people with common ideas together and then working on those ideas, it's becoming these online communities or online identities that are easily manipulable through information operations, but that create that sense of community. Just as a quick anecdote, I remember listening to a New York Times podcast about QAnon and how they were quoting a woman that, like, highly educated, having a very good job in a financial capital of the world, and she was like, "This is all about the community. Like this is what I'm looking for." So I think that's probably telling us a lot of where should we be focusing in our actions in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe we should pick up on this theme of the, as you put it, Alberto, the phenomenon of communities, the role of influencers. This sort of this intersection between the changing technologies, the form of the platform, the market for information. I write about the role of narrative in politics and storytelling, and so the ways in which there's kind of an imaginary narrative structure that enables people to feel a part of a community, and that becomes part of the kind of self-reinforcing echo chamber of these. So I'm just fascinated to see what comments you have about the way in which the intersection, I suppose, between the enabling technology of social media, the market forces that are at play, and the form of the demand, that is what is it that people want from the information they're getting? And I don't know. I see, I don't know who wants to bite on that. I see, Graham, you're nodding, so I'm going to pick on you. How do you think about that as a? I mean, this has always been true in a sense in a community, from the Salem witchcraft, that we have a long history of this as human beings. But is there something different about this moment than the intersection of the technologies, the form of the market demand, and this sort of innate human desire for community and shared stories?
Yes, the short answer is yes. The information environment itself accelerates this, and social media the advent of social media accelerates those trends. And so filter bubbles, the communities we self-select into, very, very quickly become filter walls and harden, which is a real challenge. It's not a challenge if we're talking about cat videos or cute content our favorite sports team, go Broncos. It is a challenge if we're talking about more ideological extremes, and where we're seeing groups along an ideological spectrum become further along an ideological spectrum. That's a really hard trend line for democracy. Not that everybody needs to meet in the middle and be in the middle at all times, but our ability to come together, which is the promise of democracy, to make collective decisions, diminishes over time as we see less of ourselves at each other. And social media in particular accelerates that really, really quickly. In sometimes really cool ways for groups that wouldn't otherwise be able to find each other. Or sometimes really, really negative ways. And so figuring out how to at least have an approach to those externalities is a really challenging question. It's not only for social media platforms, but for all these stakeholders involved, whether that's government or whether that's a bunch of civil society groups, which the landscape for all of our organizations on this call is becoming increasingly challenging for studying this space in particular. Media in a big way, the way that we kind of gatekeep for information or communicate information to a wider population. And basic citizens, like what does it mean to be a citizen in this era? And those platforms it's a real challenge because we see that acceleration, but those who would spread disinformation fall into or like prey on our worst notions on social media. First, the trend line that we're seeing is that this promise of social media was to create more ways to communicate and engage with each other and retain or receive information. And what we're seeing instead on a major trend line is that social media has become more of a place to just signal to others that you already believe something or that you're a part of an existing group. And so where the promise was more connection, more information, democratized information,
Yeah.
what we're seeing instead is a structured incentive for your own personal engagement on social media to be more of a part of a certain group or a select grouping, which is challenging. It means that our ability to actually engage with one another and consume information in a clear, coherent, and productive way is diminished over time. And those who would spread disinformation are right there to pick up on that trend line.
Yeah, I'm always stunned by the numbers that influencers tend to have, the number of followers that they have, and compared to the whatever viewers of the PBS NewsHour. I think, Al, you were talking about influencers. This for old people like me, it's a kind of, it's a little hard to get our head around the extent to which this whole phenomenon, whether it's cat videos, yes, but then there's Elon Musk, using his own platform. How extensive is that? I guess how much information, how much of the information that citizens get is now coming in a way through those kinds of vehicles?
I don't think we know. I think it probably, let me rephrase. I don't think there's actually an answer to that question because I think it's probably really unique to the person, their age group, their different identifiers. But I think that what draws people to particular influencers is the feeling of trust, that they can trust this person, that they have their back, that they know them, that feeling of community, which I think, Alberto, when you said that, I was like, that is perfect. I'm just taking notes because you guys are saying such great things. That's really, aligning with some of my thoughts. But, when you have an influencer, you think, if let's say they're a fashion influencer and they have a particular style that you really resonate with, and then they engage with comments the way they might respond to you, it makes you feel trusted. It makes you feel part of something. And I think that feeling to belong, it's such an innate human thing that is what the power of an influencer can be. So then when it's not to say that every influencer is doing this, but then when the market creates an incentive to spread false and misleading information because you can make money off of it, or you start to genuinely believe some of this stuff, and both of those can be true at the same time. I think I would just flag Renee DiResta has a really wonderful book about how influencers work called The Invisible Rulers that just came out that really dives into this. But that's where you start to get into this world of the power that they can have, and also the power they can have for good, right? Like it's not necessarily a bad thing that you have more people engaging on these topics. The challenge is that the ethical guidelines that you might have for a journalist are not going to be the same for an influencer that's engaging on this. And on the point about local communities, another thing I like to think about is, what are the roles to flip it? What are the opportunities about using a local community to actually address this problem? Trying to figure out who is the trusted person. I think there's a lot of good research about how getting people to believe fact checks or debunking false and misleading information is to go to the trusted individual in that community. So if it's a religious group, go to the priest or the imam about who has trust within that community, where people will believe that messenger. So I think the discussion community too, we can flip it and think about how can we use that to our advantage to boost authoritative information.
I like that. I mean, and I certainly want to come to some of the we've talking about the problems. Let's talk a bit about some of the solutions or things that some of you that you're doing or that you've seen others do that are helpful. We did promise people we would talk about AI, so let me turn the conversation to AI. As was said earlier, we imagined at the beginning of this campaign season that this would be central, and we are, as Graham, I think you quickly summarized, we're seeing a lot of AI, but it's not clear that it's that influential. I mean, I think I've read elsewhere that many people are basically saying, well, yeah, there's AI, but it's really the old stuff, or the relatively old stuff, the old being the last decade, probably, the kind of things we're talking about. But it's not so much AI generated disinformation or misinformation, but just old-fashioned. Is that right? Is that where we are right now? Alberto, I'll let you take that first, perhaps.
It's becoming like a recurring theme, but we don't know because we don't have access to good data. But by the information that we have, that seems to be the case in some countries. And I think here again, we still lack information specifically on on countries with less research organizations, and where it's more difficult to basically gain access to this type of information. What we have seen in major elections, like the European Union, the French elections, the UK, what we're seeing in the US is that even though there is uses of artificial intelligence to generative AI, they are not fundamentally sifting the scenario, and they're not sifting the scenario for probably two key reasons. The first one is that influence is very difficult, and actually most of the data that we have on how much manipulative information change people's opinion, and the key here is change, points that it's difficult to change people's opinion. So even if you have a great video, as we were saying, people just want to feel a community. So you're not going to change your opinion for seeing a deep fake, because your belief on certain things are too root in your own ideology that you're not going to change your opinion that much. So influence is actually very difficult. But we come back to this idea, it has never been a problem of supply. It's a problem of demand. In the last Philippine elections, the activists in the Philippines that were looking at the content that was being created, they were saying sometimes it's just a picture of Manila, a beautiful picture of Manila, and some music on the background, and then they just write a message below. You don't need artificial intelligence to create that content. It's not about supplying more manipulative content. It's about the receptive side, the demand side to it. So I'm not ruling out, and I think that's probably going to be the case, that in the near future we will increasingly see more and more anecdotal and non-anecdotal evidence of artificial intelligence being used to manipulate information environment. We probably are seeing, we're probably not seeing this enough, but it's happening already in countries with less robust media ecosystems, and where closed networks like Telegram, WhatsApp, Lean, and so on are more prevalent. But we still don't have the smoking gun. We still haven't seen that video that changed the results of the elections. And I don't know if that will happen in the near future. And I might be being too overly optimistic, and I hope I don't this doesn't come back to bite me. But I think that's more or less right now the situation.
Yeah, I'm curious if Graham and Ale, if you share that assessment of where we are right now. But I'm also curious about it's still early days with AI. So, where this might be going afterwards. So I'll start with you, Graham, and then come to Ali.
So I totally agree. It's early days, and it's early days for everybody. It's early days for the platforms themselves, OpenAI and the latest iteration of ChatGPT or Anthropic, or maybe these major platforms that are starting to incorporate GAI tooling into their platforms, or are GAI platforms themselves. It's early days for researchers in figuring out how to better understand its impact on the information environment. We need more data and more case studies in order to have higher confidence over the long run. And it's early days for bad actors as well. What we're seeing from foreign actors in particular is a good amount of like testing to see how they could incorporate GAI into content creation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that their information operations are having more impact. And so on things like some recent disclosures of Russian information operations, both in Europe and targeting the United States, definitely some amount of content that was generated by GAI and text-based content in particular, to do things like create content for fake news websites. But that doesn't necessarily mean that whoever in Ohio is going to see that content on the internet and be immediately more persuaded by it because it's GAI, or because it was AI generated. And so what we're seeing in general right now on this overall net impact of generative artificial intelligence in the information environment is that the advent of GAI itself diminishes trust because it makes more things possible. And that's the biggest finding. What we're seeing less of is things like one single deepfake immediately changing people's behavior at a critical moment, or people's belief structure at a critical moment. I very much agree with Alberto, and for anybody that needs to know how hard it is to change people's opinion immediately, they should remind themselves of that question during a family holiday dinner. And what we're seeing from GAI content, more pervasive again, but not necessarily persuasive. And from a content perspective, if you're talking about synthetic content, that could be text-based, that could be imagery, that could be audio. And out of those three types of content that AI can help generate, text is, generally speaking, the kind of easiest for researchers to look at. Image-based is getting there as well, but audio is much, much, much more difficult. And so in the cases that we've looked at from around the world, we've seen only a few cases. This is going to sound random, but the closest that we had in my assessment over the last year to having a deepfake impact an election substantially was a Slovak parliamentary election, which right before the actual voting happened, there was an alleged deepfake, but not at the national level, kind of at the mid-level. So it was random enough to be persuadable, but that's the closest we've gotten. Now, in the United States, we're seeing a lot of, in particular, GAI imagery used in not only election-related content, but from campaigns themselves. And that's not necessarily like a bad thing as long as it's disclosed. But we have to have some transparency measures for when GAI is used, not only for the purposes of a healthy information environment, but for the purposes of content authenticity and giving credit to the models to the information that those models were trained on.
Yeah. And Ali, I love your take on this as well. And one thing that I don't know if you could comment on, there's the content generation side of things, but there was a brief mention earlier of algorithms and the extent to which another form of artificial intelligence is getting smarter about what messages to deliver to you, and learning more and more about, in some sense, one's own vulnerabilities to propaganda and the like. And so I don't know if that's something you'd want to comment, or more generally, obviously, on your take on where we are with AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me start with Gen AI, and then I'll actually broaden it out to all the other parts of AI that exist out in the world. I think fully agree with what Graham and Alberto said, and that aligns with our work. I think the area right now where you see the most concern and that doesn't get enough attention is how Gen AI is used in harassment campaigns, particularly against women. More than 95% of deepfakes are targeting women, often non-consensual sexual imagery, for the purposes of driving women out of public life. And there's so much research about how these campaigns are doing that. That is a huge, huge disaster for our democracy. It's a problem in the US. There's a great new report, I think, by CDT that's looking at this. It's a problem globally. NDI has done some wonderful research on this. So that I just would put at people's, the front of their minds that, Gen AI, we don't know if it's having a huge impact on electoral outcomes yet. We haven't seen that. That's wonderful. But what we have seen is that it's the disproportionate on women in their lives. The other side of the puzzle too that I think is a under discussed impact of Gen AI in elections is just how the chatbots are not good at providing real-time, reliable information. There's a lot of different work that's tested chatbots about, if you just go ask, when can I register? Like, what's my deadline? It's just giving wrong information. Part of because of how, what the training data is on, what the cutoff of the training data, the actual time is. I was playing with ChatGPT a couple of weeks ago, and you asked who's running in the US election, it still said Joe Biden. So if people are using these tools to get real-time information about where they can vote, how they can vote, that's a problem because it's not always giving the most reliable content. On the broader question, AI has really been used within influence operations for years, in addition to some of the use of how algorithms have boosted false and misleading information. I'm thinking of Turkey's election last year. There was some really wonderful research that dove into how Google, the search engine, was disproportionately boosting pro-Erdogan content rather than content by the opposition or independent media. The other area that I think I know folks probably on this call have explored is that just the use of automated bots. I think that continues to be an issue. That's on the distribution side, while Gen AI is on the creation side. One of my favorite examples is this one from Kyrgyzstan, where the political parties hired bloggers and high schoolers to create to use bot networks, and one group paid $350,000 a day to create 150 profiles. So again, if you go back to follow the money, there you go on the bot side as well.
Yeah. In these conversations now, you're really beginning to focus a bit more on the so what question. So what real impact is this having? Ali, you identified a really troubling phenomenon of driving people, women primarily, out of public life and using it to harass. Graham, you mentioned trust. It's sort of the sort of generalized loss of trust that maybe this is contributing to. How would you? I'm going to continue to ask you impossible questions to which the answer is we still don't know. I recognize that, but how would you characterize the impact? We're not really seeing, at least to date, different election outcomes. Are we seeing, in your mind, acceleration of the decline in trust in the institutions, particularly in electoral institutions, in democracy, as a consequence of all of the things we've been talking about? I don't know who would. Everybody's sort of nodding here. So Alberto,
Contrary to the habit that we have developed here, we actually do know the answer to this. We have enough data. Elections are our bread and butter at the international idea, and we think this is the real danger that we're facing. As I said before, like information manipulation it's all about building and maintaining these communities and manipulating the diet of the people that belongs to these communities, isolating them from reality. But there is an objective for that, and that objective is power. There is no other reason. The only reason behind all the effort and money that goes behind this is power. Access power and eliminating the barriers to maintain power. And how do you access power in democracy? It's through elections. What do you do when you don't have a winning platform that will give you a comfortable majority of the votes and you will be able to govern for all the country? Well, you attack the electoral integrity. You attack the electoral system. You erode the trust that people put on elections. And you do that for two reasons. You do that to be able to eventually hold on to power or access power without actually having won an election. And I think we can all think of examples of people trying to do that. But you also take away or try to take away what is the fundamental part of an election, which is an election gives legitimacy to the government because it's the winner, or not necessarily the winner and all. I mean, sometimes is the parliamentary majority that has decided to form a government, but it has legitimacy. It's had the legitimacy of the ballot box, and what they are trying to do is also to erode that legitimacy. So people will stop believing in some common political knowledge, which is that you like it or not, there is a winner of the elections, and the government is there because it was voted by the people. So attacking electoral integrity is basically attacking the fundamental baseline of democracy, the fundamental common political knowledge that holds our democracies together, and is that we solve our different ideologies through voting. Not only through voting, but that's the ultimate way to solve those differences. And it's all about power. And I think we are starting to wake up to the idea, and we have already have enough close misses to wake up to the idea that this is not going to stop by fact-checking one or other fact. This is all about gaining power and retaining power. And that's where people overly dependent on information operations. That's all they're trying to do, and that should be the focus of all of our actions, to make sure that democracy is about choosing what people choose and not choosing just gaining power by any means necessary.
Yeah. Curious other comments. I mean, focusing here on a particular form of disinformation, which is disinformation about the integrity of the election. And although I guess there's also, impacts of other forms of disinformation on the level of trust that people have in the whole political system. Is what Alberto's saying pretty much aligned with your own thinking, Ali?
Yeah, absolutely. It does all come back, it seems so often, to trust, whether you're having false claims about a voting machine, whether it's going against election officials, whether it's about the institutions themselves. It degrades trust, and it's often over time. It's quite insidious. And you see that effect even look at the US. When election denialism sort of started, it wasn't immediate where you saw the effect, but now, I don't know, what are we, 4-6 years into some of these claims, you really see that tangible impact on people not feeling connected to our democracy and driving mistrust, not just in our election institutions, but all of our institutions, really. And I think, you can't have a debate around policy disagreements, around pressing challenges, if you do not share a fundamental knowledge of what's real and what's not. You can't then meet and have a good faith debate. And I think that is what can drive the deterioration of democracy. And I know it's not the election component, but what you mentioned at the beginning, if you just look at the false misleading information around the hurricanes to see how it drove a lack of trust within a really important institution, FEMA, an apolitical institution. And then that undermined FEMA had to spend time fact-checking rather than getting people resources. So it's the very tangible impact. And it's really concerning. And we see this is not just the US context. I just use the hurricane because so many folks, and I hope folks on the call have family and friends who are safe. But this is global. This is in Zimbabwe's recent election. This is Taiwan, where CCP, Chinese state narratives, are targeting the trust of the free and fair election in Taiwan. This is a global phenomenon.
Yeah. Graham, quick comment on this, and then I would love to talk all day. This is a fabulous conversation. We are just about out of time. I want to do a quick round robin around, identifying, probably in the time available, one or two things that you think are actually making a difference in this area. But Graham, comment on this question about trust in elections and democracy, and then maybe each of you a quick, so we end on a somewhat positive note, something that you think is actually useful. So Graham.
So we'll start with the bad news first, and then we'll move to the good. The challenge is that we have diminishing trust, and our information environment, or the way that technology itself, and specifically here, digital technologies that are information focused, the way that those technologies are designed, funded, and governed accelerate. May not be the sole driver, but certainly contribute and facilitate diminished trust at this point. And one really challenging aspect that we in the United States have to grapple with, and how we as a country show up in the world, is that that's a net export for us. That distrust is a net export of the United States. And that's a hard thing for somebody who has worked in public service, in the national security apparatus or foreign policy apparatus of this government to say out loud and to grapple with. But we are a net exporter of things like election-related disinformation at this point, and that used to not be the case. So that is a challenging bit of news. The one thing that I think is a net positive is I love getting on into conversations with folks like Ali and Alberto, because when we get together as civil society groups, there's always some like random examples that we're all kind of nodding at to be like, oh yeah, did you see that? Did you see that thing in Kyrgyzstan, or did you see that thing in the Slovak parliamentary election? Like that was wild, right? But it didn't. We could do something about it. And the reality for civil society groups right now in this space, which are some of the primary mechanism by which we understand the impact of the information environment on democracy, and build both rights respecting and rights protecting approaches that lead to this thing that is a core strength for us in open societies, which is an information environment that is open, secure, mostly interoperable, and mostly trustworthy. And that's the parlance that we use in internet freedom language, where Ali mentioned the Freedom Online Coalition. That's their mission among a bunch of countries. And so we know what we stand for in this space, but the groups that are guarding that space or understanding that space across civil society, it's a really challenging time. We're facing increased physical security threats for our work around the world. We're facing increased legal challenges for our work around the world from bad actors in particular. And it's really, really hard and challenging, lonely work. It's hard to look at the worst things that are happening on the internet every single day. And so we've got to come together, and we've got to kind of protect ourselves, to protect this space. And conversations like this are a major contributor to that.
Yeah. Thanks. It was mostly positive. Ali, from your perspective, what are some positive things that you just mentioned? Bringing together the groups that are really working on this, and particular examples. But is there something you would point to that you would say this is a really promising way to attack the problems we've been talking about?
Yeah, I would highlight two. My first actually it aligns well with Graham. I was going to say diverse coalitions. There's been some really interesting coming together of not just the sort of like disinformation researchers, internet freedom researchers like, myself, who spend all day thinking about this, but religious communities, like healthcare communities that are impacted by this. And I think the more diversity you have in your coalition that is thinking about how to address this problem, the more effective you're going to be, because you can reach more people. So Taiwan is just like such a great example of this. They have such a unique fact-checking initiative that it's professional fact checkers, but then it's just people who want to be involved, who are non-professionals in this and have their day jobs, which then has allowed the fact checking that it's spread through COFAX, is the group, allows them to then build trust with communities that may not be plugged into the digital rights space. You see this also in the US. There's been movement within, people on the right, on the left, coming together who are really like, hey, this is not good for our democracy. Let's figure out what principles we want. So building diverse coalitions, I think, is really, really key, and we've seen a lot of progress on. The other element is there has been some movement from democracies to try to spell out what are the principles you want to respond to false and misleading information in a rights respecting way. There's a global declaration for information integrity led by Canada and the Netherlands that has some of these good principles, lots of signatories on it. The FOC has done some of this work as well. The problem is a lot of this stuff isn't binding, so you see governments agree to it and then at home not institute it, and that's where civil society, academia, and media can step in to help hold governments accountable and say, hey, you agreed to this. Let's put this into practice. So there is a lot of attention on this, and I do think positive movement. It's just we're up against so much, and again, the incentives are quite strong to not do something about it.
Yeah, well, thanks. And Alberto, you get the last word. We reminded that we to keep it short because we're
Sure.
really at time. But please, your thoughts on this.
So I completely agree with these two ideas, and they condense already what I was planning to say. It is important to not lose the broader picture that we should consider the internet as a country, and we are all governing it, and it's a multi-stakeholder group of nations, actors that are governing it, and we shouldn't ignore the rules that run this country, where we spend like half of our day actually, or some, for teenagers probably more. So internet governance, it's a fundamental piece of the puzzle that we can't ignore, and we have seen how in the United Nations just approved the Global Digital Compact. Many nations ignore it until they realize it was going to be a serious threat to human rights and democracy, and still it's not perfect, but it got better than what we expected. But translating that into the national level requires, and this is probably unpopular on a majority of US-based audience, but it requires legislation, and it is possible. We have, sitting in the European Union, we have a perfect example with the Digital Service Act. That legislation gives us access to data that we keep saying we don't know. Well, Article 40 of the Digital Service Act forces companies to open up their data so researchers can access it. It obliges platforms to do systemic risk assessments on democracy. Article 34 of the Digital Service Act. It is possible. There is no perfect laws, but there are some laws that are better than others. So both a coalition of the willing and translating that into legislation at the national level is two of the most powerful tools that we have to protect our democracy.
That's great. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I can't thank you enough. This was a terrific discussion. As I said, we could go for another 5 or 6 hours. Really appreciate your time and insight. Also, just thank you for the work you're doing. Really, really important. We'll conclude this session now. Our next panel discussion is coming up in about 10 minutes, and I'll toss the moderation to my colleague, Professor Lynn Schofield-Clark, to moderate a discussion involving a very interesting group of civil society actors who are working on these issues and are on the front lines for that. What we're going to do now, we are part of in the 10 minutes, we're going to show some videos. We're part of a global democracy coalition called the Thank You Democracy Campaign. which is, as you can see, the participants there at the bottom, the Global Democracy Coalition, the International IDEA, and Club de Madrid, in which we have videos of people talking about, why democracy matters. Thank you, democracy. So they're really inspiring videos. We'll show those in the break here for a few minutes, and then we'll be back. Thank you all.
In every corner of the world, democracy breathes life into the hopes and dreams of billions. Today, we come together to say, thank you, democracy, for empowering, uniting, and giving us the voice to shape our future. Thank you, democracy, for the right to vote and for making our voices count. Thank you for giving us the power to create change through dialogue and understanding. Thank you for the freedom to express our ideas and inspire others, no matter where we are. From simple acts of kindness to groundbreaking initiatives, democracy enriches our lives daily. Thank you for the empathy, unity, and joy we share when we come together. Yet, the journey of democracy is one in which we all walk together. It invites us to engage, listen, and act to ensure the freedoms we cherish. We are here today to say, thank you, democracy. You give us the opportunity to speak, ask, listen, act, collaborate. Together, let's continue building our democratic journey. Let's honor those who came before us and those to come. Let's stand up for democracy and let's protect it together. The time is now.
My name is Joey. I'm a human rights and activist from Hong Kong. I'm currently in exile based in Washington, D.C., and I work for the National Democratic Institute on International Development, and we really focus on supporting the growing Hong Kong diaspora in exile communities all over the sea. I think for a lot of us, we have been working so hard to amplify the Hong Kong cause and then to elevate Hong Kong to be seen on the international stage. But I think for myself, I have really spent a lot of time and effort really to build coalitions with other oppressed communities. And over the past few years, we have built this very, very strong, impactful, and very powerful cross-movement coalition with the Tibetans, Uyghurs, Taiwanese, and Chinese dissidents who are also working to confront the Chinese Communist regime's oppressions against our communities and their aggressions throughout the world. And I think this is one of the most important things that I have achieved throughout my activism career. I think it's really important for the international community, especially government stakeholders, to always take into account the advice, the demands, and also the considerations from the activist community. As activists, we are the individuals who have endured the incredible challenges back home on the ground. We are the really experts on these issues when it comes to democracy in decline, when it comes to confronting authoritarian regimes. So I think it would be really important for the international community to continuously highlight the voices of activists, to continue to support activists in a way how we expect them to do. So I think that would be the one most important thing to do.
First and foremost, my name is Željko. I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, a small country in Europe. I'm part of Generation Democracy. IRI is the International Republican Institute's leading youth network, flagship youth network. It's actually 400 people through 47 countries all across the world. So I work at home, like I'm not in exile, but we do work with people that are in exile or being suspended from their government or prohibited from taking part in any activities. As well, I'm active politically in my own country. I'm part of the leading political party in Bosnia and Herzegovina called the SDA, the Party of Democratic Action. I serve as a member of the presidency in the youth sector, so in the youth wing of the political party. Bosnia is a very complicated country. Our war finished 30 years ago, so we were attacked by neighboring countries, and it was a difficult thing to experience. And since I come from a mixed background of all three ethnical nations and people existing in Bosnia, first and foremost, I would like to say that my work contributed to opening dialogue channels between the people there. And that's really important in Bosnia. But also, and I'm really proud of it, I managed to do this thematical session of the parliament in Canton of Sarajevo on youth. So we brought in the young people cross-sectorally, so youth political leaders and youth NGO leaders. We brought them in, got them into parliament, and they spoke with MPs on equal grounds. So they were not robbed. Well, somebody said you have 1 minute or one person can only present the topic. No, they spoke equally with government officials like ministers, deputy ministers, prime minister, and with MPs directly engaged in debate. And that session led to a conclusion that implemented over, when I converted, it's around 5 million euros in different projects, from parks to sustainable educational activities to the strategy on youth, which is this big document observing all 12 ministries in the canton. So the Internal Affairs, Justice Department, up until the healthcare, social welfare, and that 5 million euros is spread out. And now they have a commitment, a permanent legislative commitment to issue a part of their budget for young people, and as well take a part of their employment their officials, and they have to appoint a youth person, so a person that the young people can talk to in that ministry that's specifically there for you. That's I'm really proud of, and today I work with IRI and Generation Democracy to help facilitate similar things all across the globe, which is very cool. From the viewpoint of a Bosnian, a Croat living in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the international community did a lot of faults in Bosnia when we had the war there. There were mistakes made. I'm really glad, and it brings hope that the international community learned from those mistakes, and we can see the international community supporting Ukraine, Georgia, supporting now the activities in Sudan, combating and fighting the dictatorships throughout the world. But there's one more thing. It's not only, and that I cannot stress enough, and I bring 27 years living in a post-conflict society, that the process after the conflict ends is much more important than simply supporting defense and so on. Why? Because victims of the conflict, civil society activists, people who felt the pain of war need to have a final say in their own country.
And welcome back. Hope you enjoyed those videos. Certainly inspiring to see to hear the voices of people around the world who are working on these issues. We're actually interviewing a lot of our own students and community here at the University of Denver, and in future sessions we'll have add their voices to the films that we show. We now turn to the second half of our program. We have an equally impressive group to discuss the issues around AI, misinformation, and disinformation in elections. It's my pleasure now to turn the moderating role over to my colleague, Professor Lynn Schofield Clark, who is the director of the Eslo Center here at the University of Denver. Lynn, turning it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Fritz. I'm very happy to be here and happy to pick up the baton at this point. For those of you who were not able to be here with the first session, or just so that you are caught up in remembering what we have been talking about, we covered a lot of ground in the first part of this session. We talked about, for example, the fact that there's an enormous demand for disinformation right now, and that this is something that we have to kind of take into consideration as we think about the problems of disinformation. And also we heard from our experts about how difficult it is to study this topic. And also Alberto reminded us that the US is not an outlier, that this is a worldwide phenomenon that is being confronted right now in elections and in situations around the globe. It's also become more and more clear, I think, as the experts expressed to us, that the issue today is less about fact checking and more about understanding how communities are built and how ideas are reinforced. We talked a little bit about artificial intelligence, and I really liked the way that Graham worded it as AI right now is pervasive, but not persuasive. And then Ali also brought up the important point about the fact that harassment campaigns against women are some of the most prevalent ways in which we're seeing AI utilized to drive women out of power around the world. We also talked about the issue of influencers and the ways that influencers are drawing people into communities and building trust. And then Fritz reminded us as well that when we're talking about this larger topic of disinformation, we need to remember that this is not new, that we've always had stories and we've always had communities that want to reinforce the way that we think. And so he challenged us all to think about what is new about this setting. And I think all of our experts from the first panel were in agreement that what's new is that social media is amplifying the ways that these sources of information are spreading. And that I think another really great turn of phrase from Graham was that we need to consider how distrust of government now and the outcomes of continued intensifying disinformation are coming back to a degradation of trust in our institutions and in our news organizations and in our governance over time. And Graham's term was that we need to think about disinformation as a net export of the United States. And so with that, we're able to turn to this next session that we're going to focus on civil society, which are the actors that are outside of state governance, looking at how different organizations are trying to respond to the increased security threats, the increased legal challenges, and the need, as Alberto reminded us, for increased legislation. Alberto ended our last session by reminding us of the EU's Digital Services Act, which gives access to data to researchers so that we can start to understand more about the actors' motivations and efforts, as well as what's actually happening through distribution channels on these platforms that have become such an important part of our lives. So we're going to be opening up those conversations during this next 45 minutes as we wrap up this panel. My name, as Fritz mentioned, is Lynn Schofield Clark, and I'm a professor here at the University of Denver, and I teach journalism and AI as well as media ethics. And my own area of study is on young people, especially teens and young adults, and I look at the intersection of socio-political development of young people, the hybrid news information and the disinformation and other efforts that people have been trying to make in civil society to address these issues. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists for this next time. We have with us Kira Mendez, who is Director of Advocacy for the Center of Tech and Civic Life. She is working on supporting election officials and securing the resources they need to ensure that elections are safely and securely administered. And I know she's been thinking recently about the challenges of getting elections back online in areas that have been affected by Hurricane Helene and Milton. So we'll look forward to hearing her talk about some of the work that her organization's been involved in. We also have Augie Dankowski with us, who works with Democracy Reporting International and Digital Democracy Team. He's located in Berlin. He's also a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam's Department of Communication Science and a research associate with the Global Disinformation Index. He focuses on disinformation, particularly in the Balkans, and has researched the role of automated accounts or bots in pushing a strong anti-Western message, particularly in areas like North Macedonia, and the identification of sources that have been associated with Russia Today and Serbian news reports. And our third panelist is Dan Blah, who is the chief technologist and founder of Reset, which is a philanthropically funded company that seeks to hold big tech companies accountable to the values of democratic societies by promoting changes to laws, to industry standards, and to consumer attitudes. He's also the co-founder of the Open Technology Fund, which started in 2012. That's a US government-funded program that supports privacy-enhancing and internet censorship circumvention technologies. And he's worked on increasing the security security between journalists and their sources, which has become an issue in a number of locations around the world, and has also worked on several net neutrality cases. So we have a really excellent panel for us to continue to consider these issues of disinformation, and looking in particular at some of these cases that are coming up today, and what organizations like theirs are doing about them. So I'm hoping to have each of you as panelists tell us a little bit more, flesh out the intro that I gave briefly, talk a little bit about the organizations that you're working with, and how your organizations are, first of all, starting out by just trying to address issues of community awareness of the problems of disinformation. So maybe if I could turn to Kira first.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lynn. It's such an honor to be here today with such a fantastic and informed group of panelists. And I'm really excited to have this conversation because it is increasingly timely as we head towards Election Day. So my name is Kira Mendez. I am the advocacy director for the Center for Tech and Civic Life. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit that works to make the lives of local election administrators easier by providing tools and templates and trainings, and also advocating for more federal funding for election security. And the reason why we focus on that, and that's through a project called the Election Infrastructure Initiative, is because we know that the threats to election administration, and particularly the threats around the quality of information that is making its way to voters, continues to evolve. And we've seen both foreign bad actors and also domestic campaigns to try and mislead voters and mislead the public, so that it causes distrust, it can reduce participation, and it can force talented election administrators out of the field. And so we want to make sure that our elections are secure from all threats, not just threats to the voting machines themselves, but to the democratic process. And so really thrilled to talk today a little bit about how election administration and election dis and misinformation are tied together, and how it all connects to a robust system that's properly funded and where election administrators have the resources that they need to respond.
Great, thank you so much, Kira. And how about Dan? Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on, particularly if you've had some initiatives that you've been focusing on that have been effective in educating the public about identifying disinformation and trying to counter it?
Yeah, thank you. Also really glad to be here. Thank you for pulling this all together. My name is Dan, work with Reset. Our aims are to restore a healthy relationship between media and democracy, as seen by the exasperation of those relationships post-social media and sort of where we are with the big platforms. We do that through sort of social, political, and economic changes. Our theory of change really sort of revolves around the idea that without strong law and regulation put in place, this is going to continue to not be resolved. So that's kind of our primary area of work, of sort of working within the EU and the US in places, democracies that have the capability to sort of hold in check some of the powers that are now sort of consolidated within these big tech companies. We do that through market pressure, resilience, and then also working with sort of both traditional media companies and this a sort of more virtuous next generation of media companies trying to put the seeds for a better field in place. As far as the work that we do in places like the US, for example, oftentimes, and also in the EU, doing a lot of work around identifying how disinformation, the real sort of symptoms of this disconnection between like the current media companies and democracy exists, collecting a lot of information and data and trying to present that towards regulators and governments to help them sort of make changes to the existing laws or help them better enforce the laws such as the DSA that was mentioned, the Digital Services Act that was mentioned before. In the US, for example, we spend a lot of time working and supporting organizations that are within communities most affected by these and helping them road test and experiment with different inoculations and ways that can go about helping diminish the effects of misinformation, disinformation, and other sort of harms on their communities to ensure that the electoral processes, as Kira was saying, go off as best as they can. I'll stop right there. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Dan. And Augie, tell us a little bit about the work that you've been involved in and how you're trying to educate the public about countering disinformation.
Sure, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm the research coordinator at Democracy Reporting International as part of our digital democracy team. I'll tell you a little bit about Our context of Democracy Reporting International was founded more so as a kind of classic election monitoring organization that was meant to operate globally and as many locations as possible. However, around 2016, 2017, when basically everyone started paying attention to this issue, so did our organization. So we founded a digital democracy team. And with that, we started focusing our attention on a lot of the issues that we have been discussing that were covered in the first panel and we're going to be covering today. How we do this is by conducting research, by conducting evidence-based research and advocacy from data collected from various social media platforms from around the globe, from wherever we can, and communicating a lot of this research to either directly to the platforms or to policymakers in various settings where we find ourselves in a position to actually communicate and exchange these ideas. Additionally, what we do is we've created a program for capacity building to train and enhance the capacities of other practitioners in the field who may not have the digital skill set, which we recognize as lacking in the field and is necessary to be improved generally. And with this, we train practitioners all around the globe. And our projects range from, primarily we are focused on projects in the European Union, because this is where we have our main team. And this is where the legislation is strongest. But at the same time, we try to take a lot of the lessons that we learned from here and apply them to our projects elsewhere, for instance, to our projects in Brazil, to our projects in Sri Lanka, projects in DRC Congo, etc. So maybe I'll stop here and really happy to get into this discussion later.
Well, and that's a really great point, Augie, that I was thinking we wanted to go to next, which is the idea about how much we can learn from different settings. Obviously, we have such different media systems around the world that it can be challenging to try to compare and such just different legislative and governance situations as well. But I really wanted to see if we could talk a little bit about some of the successful examples that you may have been involved in or have seen about grassroots or advocacy campaigns that are mitigating disinformation. And even as I say that, I'm reminded of all of the disinformation that's been going on, and particularly issues of, in communication, what we would call astroturfing. So rather than grassroots, the astroturfing being things like, actually, there was an example that was raised in the Tau Center for Digital Journalism this past week on how fossil fuel interests have flooded a very small Ohio community of Ox County with disinformation about solar power to discourage the building of a solar farm. So first there was packing of the county's newspaper with lots of anti-solar articles, some of which claimed that solar panels are toxic. There was then the introduction of a news climate denying fossil fuel group that was presented as if it were a so-called grassroots organization, and then a text message campaign started. And all of these efforts were found by ProPublic and Floodlight and the Tow Center for Journalism to be linked through finances and overlapping political agendas. So there are organizations like that I think are trying to identify these intersections of ways that people are using the platforms and fostering and propagating disinformation. And I'm curious about if each of you could talk a little bit about some of the things that you're aware of that are initiatives that you're involved in or that other organizations are involved in that we can look to for examples of how advocacy campaigns can mitigate the impact of disinformation. So maybe I could start again with Kira.
Happy to jump in here. So first and foremost, the antidote to mis and disinformation is good information. And I think sometimes we forget that there needs to be a really clear foundation of accurate information that folks in civil society can amplify that comes from trusted outlets. So we need to give election offices the resources to be able to communicate critical information. That includes the time and place and manner of elections. It also includes increasingly the method of how elections are administered, especially as there's increased scrutiny on election offices after 2020 and the increased environment of digital mis and disinformation. A great example that just was announced earlier this week is that the Pennsylvania Secretary of State is doing a proactive digital media campaign explaining how the process functions, providing insights on the timeline of how elections are run in Pennsylvania, providing accurate information about deadlines and things along those lines. It's really important to acknowledge that, especially in environments where deadlines might evolve, especially due to things like hurricanes, for example, we need to have a central location where accurate information is originating, because folks can spend all of January and February pulling together fantastic charts for their programs on deadlines. And then if there's an emergency order or an injunction, those charts are completely out of date, and that can actually disenfranchise folks. And so making sure that civil society is oriented towards sources that will have the most up-to-date information, the most accurate information, and then are amplifying it and channeling that out to the community is really critical. The one other thing is that if we're only communicating with folks who are actively seeking information, we miss folks who are being targeted by anti-democracy adversaries. So, for example, just this week in Arizona, a segment of voters received texts telling them to reply yes to opt in to vote by text, which text message voting is not possible anywhere in the United States. We still don't know the origination of that text message campaign, but that's one of just plenty of examples of small instances of adversarial attempted disenfranchisement, so that folks feel confused, so that folks who are low information voters, perhaps first-time voters, or folks that know that policies continue to evolve, might get caught up in that disinformation and not have good information to counter that message. And third, we need to make sure that because of this, election offices can share accurate information both on their internal websites and their social media when folks are navigating to them, but they also need to be proactively communicating out to the public. And that costs resources, and that's something that is not currently met. So to put this into perspective, to send just one SMS text from an election office to every eligible voter in LA County is about $250,000. Just this past year, the total amount that Congress appropriated for elections infrastructure in all 50 states is $55 million. That's $1 million per state, and then about $250,000 per territory. That is 4 text messages in LA County. And that's not nearly enough to address the evolving threat landscape. Folks need to be able to be equipped to be more proactive in their communication, to be able to get out front and to make sure that the most up-to-date, accurate information is reaching voters. So we need 2 things. One, we need states to allocate more funding to election offices to support this proactive communication. And that needs to be supplemented with reliable and sustainable funding to make sure that we're scaling operations in election offices to respond to these evolving threats, so that no individual local election office is up against Russia or Iran or China's misinformation campaigns alone.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kira. And this kind of leads, I think, well into Dan, some of the work that your organization is doing in relation to how you're trying to bring about maybe more funding. And I'm curious about if you have some successful examples that you'd like to share in terms of advocacy or in terms of the funding work that you've been doing.
Yeah, just a plus one to what Kira was saying. I think that the importance of accurate information and ensuring that those local election, facilities and institutions receive more funding. Absolutely. I think I just want to back up and sort of talk about what has changed from our perspective on making this really difficult is the cost of collection and access to the data that's on these platforms. They have become incredibly adversarial for us to be able to do the research, from the academy all the way to civil society groups. They're doing everything that they can to make it very, very difficult to understand what actually is going on within their platforms, whether you're looking at a very, very hyper local, as your example was discussing, or looking at a state or a country-based situation. So I think the ability to understand what is being focused at us, places in the EU, for example, the DSA, are just coming into their sort of ability to enforce the degree of transparencies that were mentioned in the other panel. So we're looking forward to that. And I think it kind of speaks to what Reset has tried to do, which is to leverage the sort of rebound effect of what's going on within the EU and other places that have a more, I would say, progressive set of policies to try to keep these things in check, and leverage those for places like US that have a lot of the companies' sort of commercial power, but not a lot of laws in place to sort of keep them in check. I think there are a lot of strategies that we've seen. It really kind of boils down to, I think what Ali was one of the ones who mentioned in the last panel about sort of diminishing misinformation with the trusted people that are already in your networks. And so, in the communities that you're in, you have these sort of trusted purveyors. And when they succumb to misinformation, it becomes really bad. But when they write that, it becomes really, really good. And I think there's the having accurate information, doing fact checking, There's also a lot of work that's done on sort of pre-bunking and inoculation now, which is sort of, as you see a thing emerging, if you've got good enough information available to your community, you can start crafting narratives around that and using these trusted intermediaries to reach out to folks before they actually engage, because we know what happens when we engage. Those platforms start elevating that mis and disinformation on their platforms, whether it's Google search elevating it, whether it's Facebook or TikTok, whatever it is. So to have a good trusted sort of supernode within your community to sort of inoculate these things has been one of the most beneficial that we've seen. Very controversial. We're starting to see emerging research coming from the academy about folks that are using AI to help pre-bunk and diminish the effects of conspiracy theories. So there are things about, you know, it's not just taking a chat GTP and letting you have a conversation with sort of a refined AI. It's actually having the context, again, from those trusted intermediaries, those people, of what are actually folks within those communities engaging with and how that conversation might have a lasting effect. So we're seeing a number of things that are, I would say, lights at the end of the tunnel, although I don't kind of share the opinion of the previous panel, not to try to be controversial. I think AI's, the difference between our casual engagement in AI and those that actually know what they're doing with the current generation is very, very different. And there are increasing numbers of folks who are very well refined in their ability to use AI to use it in sort of negative, pervasive, and persuasive effects. And so I think we're not going to really know that story until that research comes out after this election. But we're already starting to see a lot of, I would say, much more specialized, refined, and expert uses of the current generation AI to affect communities both large and small. So it's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better, sort of sentiment on that. I'll stop right there.
Thank you for bringing that up, Dan, because I think that's a really important point about how there's a lot of sophistication that we're not aware of right now. And that does go to this issue that I think has been sort of a theme for today so far, which is about how difficult it is to research in this area. So I wanted to turn to you, Augie, too, just to talk a little bit about some of the successful examples that you have seen about advocacy campaigns, or if you wanted to talk also about some of the difficulties. I mean, I'm somewhat familiar with your research, and so I'm wondering if you might want to talk about that as well, about the challenges of getting access to data, getting access to ways to try to use that in advocacy campaigns or in grassroots efforts.
Sure. I mean, I'd like to comment just briefly on the previous point, if I may, kind of like from another angle. So I very much agree with everything that Dan and Kara said in terms of fact-checking, community engagement, debunking, pre-bunking, developing counter narratives, and just the overall importance of credible sources of information and credible information actually reaching a broader population. That being said, I've become increasingly convinced of this perspective that in part of our efforts to counter the broader issue of disinformation, misinformation, whatever we want to call it, one perspective that is becoming increasingly popular is that of defunding, of finding ways to defund the various pathways that actually allow for disinformation to spread. There's a lot of revenue, there's a lot of money being generated on the other side. So basically, there's a lot more money being put into disinformation campaigns than there is into efforts to counter disinformation campaigns. And I think this also ties into I want to tie it a bit into what Dan said, that actors who are aware of how to use advanced AI technologies can actually do really sophisticated stuff, and they can do it increasingly for less and less money. So it's becoming really cheap to produce a lot of content. At the same time, a lot of money is being poured into this content. I mean, earlier some figures were in the previous panel, some figures were cited in terms of what kind of amounts of money we're looking at, but there's not sufficiently enough money going into the countering thereof. And in this regard, I'd like to give a shout out to the organization that I used to work at, the Global Disinformation Index. I think they were one of the first ones who kind of picked up on this thread and really focused their efforts on defunding websites and outlets that spread disinformation. This is a very effective model. Now, that being said, as to your second question, data access and the DSA. I have thoughts here. I mean, look, the DSA is great. This is obviously a very pivotal legislation that everyone in Europe is extremely happy to have to be able to kind of build on, to develop our work. However, the fact remains that a lot of platforms still are not playing nice. X is not playing nice, and we do not know when X will start playing nice. I can tell you for a fact that our application for data access to X has been submitted for many, many months, and we do not expect to actually get the access granted. We are not alone in this situation. There's a lot of organizations, to a degree that there's organizations like GlobeSec from Slovakia and the Weizenbaum Institute here in Germany, collecting these experiences of various organizations failing to get data access so that we can go back and talk to the platforms. And it's not just X. There other platforms also make it difficult to get data. There's also an additional layer, and that's kind of written into the DSA, unfortunately, this process of applying for data access on a project basis. And this is really problematic, because what this means is that whenever you want data, you have to predefine very well in advance what kind of data you'll want, for what purposes, what you're going to do with it. And the application process takes time. So actually being able to react quickly and work with and react to events as they're developing is quite challenging, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. And I see Dan agreeing to that. And I do think this is a really important question that I wanted us to talk about, which is how civil society organizations are trying to work with technology companies, whether that is pressuring through various means or trying to collaborate. Because I think now we're talking a little bit about this issue. We've talked about defunding. We've talked about the issue of how we might want access from data. Are there other ways that that you see tech companies being stakeholders in this environment that need to be addressed, or that are being addressed by civil society organizations? Dan, how about if I turn to you first?
Yeah, I think in so much as you're on two adversarial sides of a table when it comes to sort of policy discussions to understand, but I think at this point, I think bringing up X and other partners, the way that we see civil society globally right now, when it comes to trying to identify the harms is, and I'll just speak it very frankly, they're scraping. They're using lots of different services to do lots of and if you're not familiar with scraping, it's essentially running a set of servers or bots to grab that content as if you were visiting a user. And for the most part, what I've seen is folks giving up on the idea that they're going to get access through some of the existing programs of these platforms, whether they're from the Academy, civil society, and honestly, even governments. We spent a lot of time advising the EC, the European Commission, on exactly what is required infrastructurally to build an external collection pipeline at the scale that would allow them to protect their elections moving forward. And we're able to demonstrate that in the super election that they had that culminated in the summer. And so I think at this point, it's going to be a cudgel to get them to actually come to the table and be partnering. And fortunately, with things like the DSA and some of the initiatives around kids protection in the US, I see some opportunity for that to actually be something that we can have access to. But for right now, a voluntary design, no. I think what has been really, I would say AI is somewhat different, although it's to make use of AI, to generative AI, to be able to categorize content at scale is a requirement at this point. To do the work of what trust and safety groups that got gutted in the last couple of years can do, does require this technology. But it's a catch-22. What was it built upon? Why does it have those capabilities from all of the privacy and copyright losses of civil society before it? And so it creates a lot of cognitive dissonance to know that we can make use of these technologies to confront and fight and help increase honesty and connection within our communities. But it comes at a cost of reliance on a platform that extracted and exploited a lot of those before to get to its capabilities. So I'm have lots of feelings.
Yeah, and what you're really pointing to is how much it's built into the system of the business models of a lot of the technologies to be extractive and exploitive and to benefit from the spread of disinformation, because that's kind of part of how you attract eyeballs. We know that people are more attracted to things that are going to bring about emotional responses, and so that's part of what the engine is behind these companies. So what's your thought about this, Kira? What do you think? How do you think that civil society organizations can work effectively with tech companies? Are there some ideas that you have and like to share about this?
There's a lot of positive engagements that I see coming out of the technology space, and mostly is in the form of tools and amplifying information and making sure that good information is out front. But sometimes we can see an analogy that I would use is, when you have family friends who are putting together a meal train for you and nobody asked if you were actually at your house. And so you come back from a family emergency and there's a pile of rotted food on your front step and you're like, thanks guys, this was really helpful. So the first step that's really critical before tech companies or civil society organizations do any big megaphone pushes on voter registration, on requesting an absentee ballot, on how to cure your ballot if you need to engage post-election if your ballot was rejected. They need to communicate with elections offices first. And there are avenues to do that, whether it's through directly with municipal clerks, whether it's with groups like the Election Center, whether it's with associations like the National Association of State Elections Directors or the National Association of States, Secretaries of State, or with state associations. They need to make sure that the offices know that they'll be seeing more traffic than they have in the past due to these big activations. Well, there are worse things in the world, but from an election administration standpoint, what a missed opportunity when a company like Facebook or Google does a big call out for registration and the website is not prepared for that traffic and crashes. Now you have created actually an erosion of trust in the system, and folks that were motivated to take action have now faced an additional layer of friction rather than a level of responsiveness from their election office. And that might be just the thing that discourages them from participating at all. So we need to make sure that these activations are happening in a coordinated fashion and that it's done in a way that is reflective of the most current regulations. I remember, being a Colorado voter, there have been large-scale programs where you get a text 2 weeks before Election Day that says the deadline for voter registration is tomorrow. The deadline to request your absentee ballot is tomorrow. Well, that's actually not true in Colorado. We have convenience voting where for that 2-week period, folks actually can come in and request and cast a ballot at any point between the early voting period and Election Day. That's different in other states. So it's harder for folks that are tuning in little fits and starts to actually make sure that they're amplifying that accurate information. And that's why that collaboration is really important. And also really important for them to vet the outlets that they're linking. The one other thing that I'll say is something that concerns me over the long term, and I've seen some good responsiveness from ChatGPT and other folks in the short term, but I think this is going to continue to be a conversation, is companies are going to be incentivized to use chatbots and other AI to answer election questions. And that is really fraught to do because we know how personalized election information can be and how nuanced it is even at the local level. And we see in North Carolina right now that over the course of the next 2 weeks, we will see an evolution of where just the temporary facilities for USPS will be because of disaster response. So we need to make sure that as we are transitioning to those tools, that the offices themselves are actually equipped to be the megaphone and that there is some level of connection between, automation and efficiencies and accuracy, and we don't throw accuracy out the window.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And that's such a timely and important issue right now as we're looking at all these disasters that are happening within, the month before the US election. I wanted to ask you, Augie, too, this question about how civil society organizations can work effectively with tech companies. I think you're doing that on a number of fronts. And I know when I actually just got back from ACREA, which is the European Communication Research and Education Association meeting. And I know there's a really vibrant discussion among communication researchers on this issue of the role that civil society is to play and how it's played out in European context versus US context. So I'm curious from your perspective about the role of civil society organizations from various places around the world and how they interact with the tech companies that tend to be located in the US.
I mean, look, I can respond to this positively or more realistically. And my best response is coming from my experience here in the EU. So what we do a lot and what the DSA has allowed to happen, or also kind of like non-binding agreements that have been signed by companies prior to the DSA, lots of codes of conduct got established, which put together on one table civil society organizations, platforms, and other representatives. And these are focused on various issues, whether disinformation, whether generative AI, whatever issue is kind of coming up. You kind of create a new code of conduct. You put together a group of organizations that will be involved there in the platforms. And then you have these regular weekly check-ins, more or less, to have an exchange of information and ideas. Now, one would assume that this is quite beneficial, but in reality, a lot of the platforms simply have representatives in these meetings that are there because they need to be there and not because they are taking any significant action. So a lot of the kind of advocacy that we do ends up being more effective, not when we do it through these formal channels, but more so when we contact platforms directly via informal channels that we've established through personal connections, either going to conferences or whatnot, and just getting to know people. And this is actually something that we've been discussing a lot, that it's really an issue that there's insufficient formal pathways to actually file complaints, to actually communicate with platforms when you do note policy violations or whatever it is that you'd like to communicate, and that a lot of this is contingent on personal connections. So while there has been progress with the establishment of these codes of conduct, some of which are being translated into somewhat more binding codes of practice, we're not there just yet. I think a lot more can be done by tech companies, and I think a lot more can be done by legislature to actually force tech companies to participate proactively. This is within the European Union. I do not want to comment on outside of the EU simply because I feel like I would be misinforming here, and I don't want to do that. But my sense is that communication there is significantly harder than really what pathways do you really have to communicate when there's no legislature to actually back you up to communicate the policy violations with companies.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's a very, very big challenge that I think we're facing, especially as we're looking at some. And I would like to actually ask us a little bit to think about some of the primary obstacles that your organizations are facing right now in terms of combating disinformation and misinformation. I really appreciate your comments, Augie, about just the structural issues of how we've even set up structures to try to maintain relationships and to have these conversations about tech and design and their role in kind of mitigating against disinformation, and how challenging it is just to try to have to rely then on personal relationships. I'm curious if you all could talk a little bit about something that is an obstacle that you're facing and that you see other organizations facing that may help those of us who are listening to think about what we can do to be supportive of the organizations, to be supportive of efforts that we think that I think we're all in agreement are valuable for the future of democracy. So tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that you're facing and what we, the public who's concerned about these things can do to help. So Dan, can I turn to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Reset works globally, so it's every different region that we are working in. The answer is a little bit different. I think going off what Augie was saying, in the EU, we've got it's really hard to know exactly how much power the DSA could give the EC. It really comes up to their own volition and their capacity. So I would say, if you're in the European side, part of civil society, this is a good time if these issues fire you up to get involved with increasing the capacity of the government there, either from a civil society perspective and trying to figure out how to answer some of those really good questions that Augie said are needed to be solved. If you're in the US, this is elections. I think, right now work with your local communities to elect everyone from better municipal, state, and federal officials that understand how much of our sort of day-to-day experience has been given away to these companies, and we want to try to claw some of that back and keep it from getting worse. So elect better people. I think that's about our only option right now, because there just isn't a legislative, as it was said by Kira and Augie, like in the US, a possibility in the same way. I think, if you're in the sort of technology space, there is a pipeline issue of technology capacity because of that sort of adversarial nature of the companies within civil society to know how to confront these things. So if you have an interest, you're coming from either the academy or civil society with a technology background, bringing that into the communities that you work with that are being confronted with these issues is needed right now. If you are a technologist and you want to try to get back, spend a lot of time trying to train up other people and give off like the knowledge that we've got. I would say I'll stop right there. I think that there's so much that can be done in this space. But yeah, I think, give to the public servants in the EU, elect better folks and work within local elections, support your candidates and support your communities to get better folks in office here in the US. And then if you're a technology person, apply that towards this space, and or if you're well seasoned, try to figure out how to bring up other people so that we've got more of a pipeline of public interest technologists in this field.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Dan. Kira, can I ask you to respond?
Absolutely. I think there is a challenge to the spirit and then a logistical challenge. And the challenge to the spirit is that we have over 8,000 local election administrators. Every single zip code in America has a local election administrator that is within driving distance to them for the most part. And these are really good people who are underpaid and underappreciated and put under a tremendous amount of stress and increasing vitriol over the past years. And to do everything that you can to help and still have them have challenges that civil society can't help them with, and to have these attacks on them be so unpredictable. It's like a constant just source of sparks, and you never know which ridiculous conspiracy theory is going to catch in which locality. It is draining, and it's really hard on election administrators themselves. That's why we've seen so many folks exit the field recently. The good thing about that is that I've seen a tremendous amount of community be built, and I think there is more support among the election administration community of each other than I've ever seen, and more of a willingness to activate and advocate. And so that leads us to the logistical challenge, which is that we need resources yesterday. It is slow going to move meaningful support to election offices. And we face both a political challenge and then the bureaucratic challenge of how is the money that is passed actually making it down to these rural communities in particular, because those folks do not have the capacity to go through multiple grant applications. They often are working just a few days a week, and just getting through their election workload is more than full time. So that is a nut that we are going to continue to have to crack. And for anyone that would like to help, I really encourage you to visit electioninfrastructure.org, where we're always looking for folks to engage to help us pass more meaningful funding to get us out of this mess.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Kira. And thanks for that shout out to electioninfrastructure.org. It's good to have really specifics that people can follow up on, because I'm sure that there are people, especially those who are listening in Colorado, who have been following the situation with Mesa County and we're kind of ground zero of some election blockade issues. So now let me turn to Augie to tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're seeing as primary obstacles and things that people on this call could do to sort of help to be part of the support in moving things toward the right direction.
I mean, I'm afraid I'm the pessimistic voice on this call.
That's okay.
Let me just outline my thoughts. I mean, I think everything that was mentioned already fully agree. If I were to summarize my thoughts in like 3 main points, I guess, it would be there's obviously a continued need for funding for CSOs that are involved in this area. And this the lack of funding causes issues from 2 perspectives. One is that, overall funding to run programs, to run projects, to be able to execute research. The second is that CSOs may find themselves lacking the technological talent that is necessary and the technological skill set that is necessary, simply because for-profit corporations can offer better paychecks to people who have the necessary skill set to do this work. So you really kind of need to be in the right spirit to want to do good for democracy to get involved in this kind of work. So this issue of funding has these 2 kind of perspectives to it. So that's one issue that really needs to be addressed. The other one, obviously, is for us to be able to do advocacy, we need to have evidence. And to have evidence, we need to have data access. And to have data access, platforms need to comply to legislation. So I guess maybe the one recommendation I can give for people outside of the EU is to push for local representatives to look, and I don't want to say this to really speak very highly of the DSA, but in many ways, right, it is a landmark framework, and I don't want to speak for Brussels effect, but it could be quite interesting or useful for other countries to see how the DSA plays out in the next period in the European Union, learn some lessons from that, and apply it to their local context based on their specific local needs, to basically force companies to be responsible towards the civil society organizations globally as they are within the EU. So this is kind of maybe the recommendation.
Thank you. Yes, and that's really helpful. And I think it does tie us back into the need for us to continue to learn from each other and to try to continue to build coalitions that across various sectors in society around the world. And we're out of time. And so I want to remind people before I give the mic back to Fritz, that we do have a couple of events coming up next week at the University of Denver. We have a couple of master classes specifically for students, but others are welcome to attend as well, featuring political commentator David Von Draley. Friday evening's event at 4 is on AI disinformation and the future of democracy. And so you're welcome to attend that. We also have live streaming. So if you're interested, please go to the Homecoming DU website to register and join the live stream. Thank you very much. And let me turn it back over to Dean Mayer.
Well, thank you, Lynn, and thank you so much, Kira, Augie, and Dan for that really informed conversation. It was, I won't attempt to summarize it, but it between that and the earlier conversation, I think we've had an extraordinarily rich conversation. It's a little daunting in terms of, it certainly reinforced the sense of challenge that we have, that we face. But I think on the positive side, it also reinforced the value of shedding light on these issues, and the importance of the conversations that we've had today. Just a quick reminder that another upcoming event on November 15th, we'll have a U.S. elections debrief. We will maybe know the outcome of the election at that point. There'll be a lot to talk about, I'm sure. And then, of course, we have the Democracy Summit coming up in January. So with that, I thank you all in the audience who've listened to us now over 2 hours. And very much great thanks to all of our panelists and participants today. A really wonderful discussion. Thanks.